The Roman legions were used to marching toward conquest, expanding the empire and imposing Rome's will on its enemies. But when Caligula, the most controversial emperor in history, led his troops to the shores of Britain, what happened next left everyone bewildered. Instead of ordering an attack, he did something unexpected. He commanded his legions to collect seashells along the shore. Was this a symbolic gesture, part of a larger plan, or just another act of madness from an unstable emperor? Could there have been a hidden strategy behind this apparent oddity? Or was it simply another example of how Caligula defied conventions? In this video, we're going to dive into the details of this much-debated expedition. The reasons behind this unusual order may surprise you as we explore whether it was a strategic move or the definitive sign of a reign marked by insanity. What really happened in Britain? Stay with us and find out. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, ascended to power in 37 AD as the third emperor of Rome. His initial reign was filled with promise, as the young emperor was seen as a beacon of hope after the somber rule of Tiberius. Early in his rule, Caligula's decisions were praised for being wise and calculated, bringing stability to Rome and earning the admiration of the people. However, what followed was a drastic shift, as his reign quickly descended into infamy, marked by accusations of madness, cruelty, and a complete disregard for Roman customs and laws. The figure of Caligula has since been shrouded in mystery. Was he truly mad, or was there a deeper genius at play in his seemingly erratic actions? Historians have long debated whether Caligula's behavior was the result of illness, or whether it was a deliberate act of political theater. Some suggest that he suffered from an illness during his reign that affected his mental stability, pointing to accounts of his fever and supposed coma that changed him dramatically afterward. Others argue that his bizarre behavior was a form of calculated madness, meant to instill fear in his enemies and assert total control over his empire. This theory holds that Caligula, like other Roman leaders, understood the power of spectacle in ruling the masses. His acts, though seemingly insane, may have been a way of crafting an image of himself as both untouchable and terrifying. Yet Caligula's unpredictability extended far beyond the political stage. He was infamous for his personal indulgences, spending vast sums on elaborate games and building projects, and engaging in scandalous acts that shocked the Roman elite. His actions seemed to challenge the very idea of what an emperor should be. Was this a form of rebellion against the expectations placed upon him? Or was it simply evidence of a man who had lost touch with reality? His legacy, filled with tales of his supposed madness, has led many to overlook the possibility that Caligula was more methodical than commonly believed. One of the most curious aspects of Caligula's rule was his desire to expand Rome's borders. Despite his erratic nature, he displayed a deep ambition to strengthen the empire through military conquest. His focus turned to Britannia, a land that had long intrigued Rome but remained unconquered. The potential for glory and expansion was great, yet in typical Caligula fashion, what unfolded during this expedition would only add to his complex and controversial legacy. The journey to Britannia was not merely a quest for land, but a reflection of the unpredictable nature of Caligula's reign. As Caligula prepared for his grand expedition, his motivations were clear to many: expand the empire, secure his place in history, and assert Rome's dominance over the untamed lands of Britannia. However, what occurred when his legions reached the shores would forever be remembered not as a triumph of Roman might, but as a moment of sheer perplexity. This expedition, which began with such high hopes, would become one of the most debated and bewildering events of his reign. In the year 40 AD, Caligula set his sights on Britannia, a territory that had thus far remained untouched by Roman forces despite earlier invasions and conflicts. His decision to march northward seemed to be a natural extension of Roman ambition. Britannia was seen as a land of great strategic importance, holding both military and economic value. It was also a land shrouded in mystery for the Roman Empire, inhabited by tribes that were seen as barbaric and untamed. Caligula's plan to conquer this distant island aligned with the imperial goals of previous emperors, but the execution of this plan was anything but ordinary. The preparations for the campaign were grand and ambitious, with legions gathered along the northern coast of Gaul. Soldiers were trained, supply lines established, and expectations for a swift and decisive victory were high. Yet whispers of doubt lingered among the ranks. Caligula's behavior had become increasingly erratic, and there were concerns about whether this expedition was grounded in strategic necessity or driven by the emperor's unpredictable nature. Nonetheless, the legions remained committed, following their orders with the discipline expected of Roman soldiers. When Caligula's forces finally reached the shores of the English Channel, what transpired next left both his troops and historians baffled. Instead of launching an invasion, Caligula reportedly instructed his men to line up along the beach and collect seashells, declaring that they had conquered the ocean. This peculiar act, seemingly devoid of any military purpose, has been interpreted in various ways over the centuries. Some believe it was a symbolic gesture, an offering to Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, symbolizing Caligula's dominance over the natural world. Others see it as a sign of the emperor's declining mental state, evidence that he had lost touch with reality. The seashell incident is one of the most enigmatic moments of Caligula's rule, and it has sparked endless debate among historians. Was this a ritualistic act meant to assert his divine status, or was it simply a moment of madness? Caligula had a history of blurring the line between the divine and the human, often claiming himself to be a living god. Could the collection of shells have been a part of this larger narrative, an attempt to show that even nature bowed before him? Or was it a humiliating retreat disguised as victory, a way to cover up the failure to launch a successful invasion? For the soldiers, the expedition was nothing short of bizarre. The expectations of conquest had given way to confusion and frustration, and for many, it marked the point at which their loyalty to the emperor began to waver. While Caligula returned to Rome and celebrated this victory with triumphal displays, the reality was that his reputation among his troops, and indeed across the empire, was irreparably damaged. This episode in Britannia would later be seen as a turning point in his reign, further cementing his legacy as a ruler driven by whim and spectacle rather than by logic or strategy. The sight of battle-hardened Roman soldiers, trained to conquer and subdue entire nations, bending down to collect seashells on a foreign beach, must have been surreal for those present. For centuries, this peculiar moment has fascinated historians, with interpretations ranging from symbolic gestures to outright madness. At the heart of this mystery lies the question: was there a deeper significance behind Caligula's command, or was it simply an act born out of his mental instability? To understand this, we must explore both the symbolic potential and the more disturbing aspects of Caligula's mindset during this period. One interpretation is that Caligula's order to gather seashells was a symbolic act of victory over Neptune, the Roman god of the sea. The Romans had a tradition of linking divine favor with military success, and it's possible that Caligula, always obsessed with his own divinity, saw this as a way to demonstrate his power over nature itself. By collecting these shells, Caligula might have been signaling that even the sea, an unconquerable force, was now under his dominion. This kind of gesture, while baffling to many, would not have been entirely out of character for a ruler who often blurred the lines between mortal and divine. However, the more likely explanation, according to many historians, is that Caligula's actions were a sign of his deteriorating mental state. The emperor had long shown signs of instability, with previous acts of bizarre behavior, including appointing his horse as a priest and threatening to make him a consul, fueling the belief that he had lost touch with reality. The collection of seashells may have been the culmination of his decline into madness, an action that had no strategic or symbolic meaning, but instead reflected the disorganized mind of a ruler who could no longer distinguish fantasy from reality. There's also the possibility that the entire event was a theatrical performance orchestrated by Caligula. Throughout his reign, he demonstrated a flair for the dramatic, often engaging in acts that seemed absurd but served to reinforce his image as an unpredictable and powerful leader. By confusing both his soldiers and his enemies, Caligula may have sought to maintain a psychological advantage. In this sense, The seashells could have been a prop in a larger game of political theater, designed to keep everyone, from his own legions to Rome's enemies, in a state of constant uncertainty. Regardless of the interpretation, one thing is clear: this moment had lasting consequences. Caligula's reputation, already fragile, was further damaged by the expedition's strange conclusion. The Roman military, built on discipline and conquest, was left confused and demoralized by an order that seemed to defy every principle of warfare. For Caligula, the seashell episode became another infamous entry in the long list of actions that defined his reign as erratic, unpredictable, and deeply controversial. The true nature of his actions may never be fully understood, but their impact on his legacy is undeniable. The aftermath of Caligula's British expedition was met with widespread confusion and derision across the empire. His decision to return to Rome and celebrate the gathering of seashells as a military triumph was seen by many as an embarrassing farce, further alienating him from both the Senate and the military. This was not the first time Caligula's actions had been met with disbelief, but it was perhaps the most damaging. The emperor, who had once held promise as a capable ruler, was now viewed almost universally as a man driven by ego and delusion, rather than by any coherent strategy. For the Roman military, the expedition was a low point. The soldiers, who had been prepared for a significant campaign in Britannia, were instead left to participate in what felt like a meaningless charade. The legions, used to achieving tangible victories, were forced to parade through Rome with spoils of war that amounted to little more than seashells. The sense of frustration and loss of morale would have lasting effects on their loyalty to Caligula, whose leadership was increasingly seen as a source of instability rather than strength. This breakdown in trust between the emperor and his military would become a critical factor in the events that followed. The Senate, too, was appalled by Caligula's actions. While the emperor had always had a strained relationship with the senatorial class, his behavior following the British expedition deepened the divide. The senators, many of whom already questioned his judgment, saw the expedition as further proof that Caligula was unfit to rule. His disregard for the traditional expectations of Roman leadership was no longer viewed as eccentric. It was seen as dangerous. This growing discontent within the political elite would sow the seeds for conspiracies that would ultimately lead to Caligula's assassination just a year later. Despite the ridicule and contempt that followed his British campaign, Caligula's reputation in history has always been complicated. Some historians, particularly in modern times, have re-examined his reign through a more nuanced lens. They argue that the emperor's actions, though extreme, may have been part of a broader strategy of psychological warfare and spectacle. Caligula understood the importance of image and perception in maintaining power, and it's possible that his bizarre behavior was a deliberate attempt to cultivate an aura of unpredictability that kept both his enemies and his allies off balance. Nevertheless, the legacy of Caligula's British expedition, and indeed his entire reign, is largely defined by his erratic behavior and seeming detachment from reality. The image of an emperor commanding his legions to collect seashells on a foreign shore remains one of the most enduring symbols of his rule, encapsulating the mix of madness, spectacle, and unpredictability that characterized his time as Rome's leader. Whether there was method to his madness or not, Caligula's actions left a lasting mark on the empire, shaping how future generations would view both his reign and the nature of imperial power.